Hi, I'm Tom from Mark 7 Reloading. In this segment, we're going to go over how you're going to receive your Revolution. It's going to come in a pallet and all of the boxes inside. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to open everything and do an inventory. Let's go ahead and do that now. All right, so at this point, we've got our wrapping off. We've got our press located in our crate. This is going to be our bullet feeder. Our case feeder is in this box, and then all of our accessories are going to be in our long box and large boxes. Okay. All right, so inside of the crate, you should find your user manual along with your welcome to the family letter. All right, to remove the press from the crate, we're going to need a 1/2-inch socket to remove the lag bolts. So we'll go ahead and do that. One. And two. Now we're going to need a second person to help us lift this, and we're going to place it right on the bench. It's important that we keep our crate in a location in case we ever need to return it back for service or update in the future. The next thing on the list is we're going to take all of the items out of the boxes, bring them out on the table so we can do a full inventory. So now we've got everything laid out on the table, I'll kind of point. So this is going to be our primer vibratory controller. This is going to be our digital powder measure along with the electronics box. Everything for our bullet feeder. We've got our case feed and bullet feeder pole stands along with the tops, our case feed assembly, our tablet, our spent primer hose, and all of the small accessories that go along with it, as well as the USB cables, tablet holder, additional spring assemblies, wire management, and cabling are all in our ACO bin. So to install our pole assemblies, we're going to need a 5/32 Allen and a 10mm nut driver. The first thing I'm going to do is make sure that my base plates are tight with my 10mm. Go over and check all 8. Okay, and now I'm ready to install my poles. So first we will remove the bolt and install the pole assembly. And we're going to repeat that for both poles. Okay. Okay. So on this side, we're going to install our case feed. This is for pistol, so we're using the short version. If it were rifle, we would have the extended. And on this side, we are going to install our bullet feeder adapter. So now we are ready to place our case feeder in place. So first we'll make sure our screws are backed out, and we just simply set it right down on. Okay. We're going to go ahead and route our cable out of the way. So the next thing is we're going to install the components to our priming system. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this cable tie. And we'll open our controller box. Okay. Now on our priming system, we want to make sure that the controller box is plugged into the wall outlet and our motor cable is plugged into the controller box, just like so. Now we have our primer ramp sensor on the front, and that is going to be plugged into our control box as well. So next we're going to install our tablet mount and our tablet. A couple things to make sure is that this is tight with a Phillips. good. Initially, we'll loosen this. We're going to install this on our case feeder pole. Okay, I prefer using the 4 short legs that come with it. For a later date, you must install the 4 stop pieces to keep your legs in place. Okay, with all 4 installed, we simply place it on and lock it in place. Now you want to make sure you get a good angle so it's tipped up so you can see it good. Lock everything down. We will unbox our tablet. And simply place it. So in the back of your console, you will find a hardwired DC power cable. We want to route that to the charging outlet on the top of the tablet. In our acro bin, we're going to find our micro to micro USB cable. This can be plugged into the top of the tablet and routed down to the micro USB on the side of the console. It's important to keep these separate from all of the other cables. Okay. Next, we're going to install our powder measure. So if we open this box, inside we will find the digital powder measure in this case. We have an upper and a lower piece. We can install the lower temporarily. So now we want to take our hopper assembly, remove our baffle, install it into our lower, and press our hopper in place. It's fully seated before we install. And now we're going to look at the electronics side. So we've got our data cable, our power cable, and our powder control electronics box. Okay, so we're going to supply power from the box to the wall. We'll make sure this is in the off position. And we're going to run our data cable, which is a 4-pin electronics box, to port number 7 on the console. At this time, we can take our 6-pin cable that we have coming from our powder measure and put it into the 6-pin connector on the back of the electronics box. At this point, we want to go back and check our work. And so we're going to make sure that our powder funnel is fully seated. You may have to use pressure using the bench or the floor to make sure it's all the way down, as well as your baffle is lined up properly. Now we're going to continue on and complete our cable connections. And so I'm going to point out that we've got our power supply. It's going to plug in right here in the back. We've got our 4-pin to 6-pin. This is the power that goes from the console assembly to the motor. Here we've got our 8-pin to 8-pin. Again, this goes from the console to the motor. And we've got our standard USB to micro USB. And so we'll start with that. We're going to route it around the back and right into the side of the console, into our USB port. I'll fold this and tuck it just slightly under. And now we can install our 8-pin. And we're going to plug it into the top of our motor, around the side of the console, and into the 8-pin slot. Next is our motor 4-pin to 6-pin. So again, this will go into the top of the motor in the 4-pin. We're going to loop it around and down and into the 6-pin on the console. Lastly, we're going to take our power supply, make sure it is firmly seated, and now our connections are ready to be plugged into the wall to power on the unit. So first, we're going to power the console on. You'll hear an audible sound as well as see an amber light on the back of the motor. Okay, next, we're going to turn on our tablet, which is just holding down the power button for a few moments. Now, as this boots up, I want to point out, it's very important that you run this to its own dedicated circuit or power strip. Don't plug a variety of things into it because we want to make sure it's getting a good solid power supply. Now that we're at our main menu, we're going to go ahead and press loader. This is going to bring us to our waiver screen. Right now the software on the tablet is communicating with the firmware on the console, and we'll press accept. At this point we need to perform a calibration, so we're going to go ahead and do that. First, making sure that the shell plate is clear of any obstructions. We're going to press calibrate. We're at the top of our stroke. It will go to the bottom. Find bottom crank position, find top position, and now we're ready. So now that our press is live, the next thing we want to do is move over and verify our connections on our powder measure and our primer controller assembly. So before we power on our powder measure, we always want to make sure that the arm is in the plunger, is in the up position. If you were to have powder in here, you would want to hold a case underneath the funnel so as to not spill on the press. So with that in the up position, we're going to power the unit on. Ensuring it did a good calibration, it went from top to bottom. We're ready to go here. On the primer controller vibrator, we're going to go ahead and power that on as well. Now, we don't have any primers. We just want to make sure operation-wise everything is functioning, vibrating. We're going to come back to this in our primer segment. Good, we can power it off now. We'll go ahead and power off our powder measure, and we'll raise our arm back to the top again. We're going to finish by installing our case feed adapter in the bottom. This will require some pressure. A little lubrication may be needed. We're going to install our switch assembly, and we can plug that into our case feed motor. And finally, install our drop spring assembly, which I will be using this 330 to tighten the upper, and this needs to be placed on the plastic. And again, check operation. Adjustments for the case size are right here for the switch itself. And in the next segment, we'll go over the installation and setup of the bullet feeder. Next, we're going to set up our bullet feeder. So we'll go in our package, make sure we have all of our components. So here's our output spring, our manual. Here's our assembly. Now be careful when unpackaging this. Sometimes our shim cards are laying inside, so we're going to do this nice and gentle. Okay, and we'll place this to the side for a moment. Now we're going to look in our bag, because as times you will find, there is a powder funnel that we will not be using for the Revolution, so we'll put that to the side. And it looks like here's some cards. Okay, now it should come with 4 total, 2 thick and 2 thin. And here I have the 2 thick are taped together, and here are the 2 thin. Okay, we'll keep going. Now we've got our dropper assembly and our power supply. And so that's everything we need for our bullet feeder setup. Now let's go through these individually. We will take our bullet dropper assembly. Here you'll find extra check balls, and when you go to do maintenance on this and take it apart, be careful. There are 3 check balls and you may lose them, so they supply extras. Now we're going to need a 5/64 Allen to loosen this, and you will find that sometimes these pins are bent, and it's okay. We just gently bend that straight back up to get it out of the way. Okay, so we'll go ahead and take our Allen. And now we can separate the lower die from the dropper assembly. Let's go ahead and place our die. We will place our dropper assembly on top. And now we're going to go ahead and take our assembly. And what we want to do is pull back our spring-loaded assembly and spin our shell plate so it fully seats down. Okay. Now we're going to take our shim cards. And for each caliber is going to be specific. And so what we'll do is we'll put all 4 in for now. First I'm going to remove the extra tape that's on here. And we'll simply place those all 4 into their spot. And next we're going to open our output spring assembly. And for this we have a small Phillips head screwdriver, and in this case we need to back it up slightly. We can now insert our drop tube, and if you notice there is a slit in the back, we want to make sure that's facing towards the back or downward, which allows any media to fall out. Now we can take our assembly and put it on our pole. Temporarily swing these back. Want to use the existing bolt and washer that's in your top of the bowl and place it in. Now to secure it, we'll need a 1/4 inch Allen, and we want to line up the output assembly right over top of our dropper, and we will tighten our bolt. Excellent. So this will go here. Once we set our dropper, we will have to trim the spring of any excess, and you will again need a 5/64 Allen to back up the set screw. Now our power cable assembly requires find in your acro bin, so we would like to install that next. What you'll find is there's a short and long, and you'll find the same on your filter assembly. So we'll put those male and female connectors together, and then we'll install them on the dropper assembly. In the same fashion, a short and a long. Let's move on to the power supply. In this package, you'll find that there is a European or a 220. We're going to put that to the side. And here's our standard for 110. So we'll go ahead and untie these. What we want to do is have one plugged into our power supply. We're going to plug that into our controller. And follow our lead up the pole, route it through, and plug it right into the power. Now we're able to check operation by simply turning the dial. Excellent. Now what we want to do is at a good 45-degree angle, and you may need to loosen and retighten. So follow the guide. That is a good 45 degrees, and that's our perfect starting point. Once we set the dropper, we will need to trim off our excess spring assembly. Now that we've got all of our connections in place, and we have everything powered on, before we press our calibrate, we're going to verify our operation in neutral. And so to do so, we're going to press the stop button and neutral. We're going to wait a few seconds for the motor to unlock. We're going to use an 11/16 boxed offset wrench. This will allow me to operate the press up and down, checking for any obstructions, in full operation. This is also very helpful during the loading process to clear any jams or malfunctions that we may have and get the feel for the press of how it should feel in neutral. Now to exit out, we simply hit OK. And now we can go back to perform our calibration. So now that we've calibrated, I'm going to go over some of the basic settings on the tablet. On the top, you'll plainly see the speeds variation. So I'm going to hit run and you'll be able to see that changes along with the speed I select. Okay, 2000 is where you're likely going to start, so we're going to leave it there. Now to explain the digital clutch, that is a number between 0 and 20, and it's the downward force being applied on the cartridge being loaded. So there are rules of thumb that you will find in the user manual. Pistol settings are generally between 3 and 6. Rifle settings are generally between 6 and 12. This is a 9mm machine. We're going to go ahead and set that to 3. The goal there is to only use what is needed. If you're exceeding a certain point, an example would be in pistol. If you're having to push it past 6 and get to 7, you need to take a step backwards and look at the components that you're using, because you may be putting in brass that wasn't properly lubricated or wasn't prepared properly, and it's requiring you to increase the clutch. Another possibility of having to increase the clutch could be that there is an obstruction and you would need to troubleshoot that. The solution is not to just drive the clutch up. Moving on to the torque sense, you're able to enable or disable that. You always want to leave that enabled. And what that does is it, on the upstroke, prevents damage from occurring in the indexing mechanism. If you notice during operation, upstroke is when your shell plate indexes. And so we have this feature in place to protect the internals of the machine and ensure that you have smooth operation in sensing any kind of obstruction that would prevent the tool head from rising or the shell plate from turning. Now the jog up and jog down feature are just like they sound. You're able to jog the press through all of its functions back and forth. When you're done, you want to hit end cycle. The goal of the press is to always complete a cycle. As we move on downward, you'll see that the single cycle does exactly like it sounds. But if I were to jog even the slightest bit and back up, it disables features like the single cycle, or another feature we'll talk about in a moment, which is move to bottom. And the reason behind that is because the press knows it has not completed a cycle. So if I do hit end cycle, it will re-enable those features. Okay, moving on to our monitor screen, you'll notice that you're able to preset or program an amount of strokes or cycles that the machine can do. So by selecting any one of these, we'll use set brass, I'm able to program a certain amount of strokes. In this case, I'll put 100, and I want it to stop at a certain amount. In this case, I will hit 95. Now when I press run, you'll notice the rounds made being count up. You'll notice the component counting down. The press will stop at whatever I preset it to. And to make this back to normal, I will simply erase it. We'll hit 0 and enter, and I will erase this, hit ignore and enter. And now we're back to normal operation. Any one of these three can perform the same function. The rounds made is a rolling count, or an odometer if you will, for your press. You can disable that or you can reset it at any time. The rounds per hour is an actual output, and so you can monitor your actual output, which is based on an algorithm of the servo motor. Moving on to the sensor menu, this is where you're going to enable or disable any of the sensors that are available on your press. To go down the line, you've got your powder measure, powder sense, swage sense, bullet sense, prime orientation, decap, remote stop, and safety shield. This is specific to the Revolution. If you had one of our other products, like an Evolution, an Apex, or a 650, or a 1050, for example, you may have a different layout on here. So the sensors that we will always leave enabled will be the powder measure and the swage sense if you own one and it's installed. Moving on to the setup menu, this is what is allowing us to control the indexing, the bottom dwell or top dwell of the press. So generally speaking, I would suggest you start out with an index of 3 for the Revolution, and if you notice, it slows down the indexing of the shell plate. Our loading is only limited to the speed that we're able to not topple bullets or spill powder. And so by creating an index of 3, which can be increased as far as you'd like to 9, we're able to not spill powder or topple bullets. Now there's also too much, which would cause issues like it not ejecting properly. So that's what I'd suggest with starting around 3, and you can increase or decrease from there. But that is a good setting for any loading, most calibers, between 2,000 and 3,000 rounds per hour. Now, a top and bottom dwell could come in when you are dealing with a lot of powder. And so the things we can't control are centrifugal force and gravity. And so by creating a top dwell, I'm allowing the powder measure to fill up a large volume. An example would be like a 308. And a bottom dwell is allowing the tool head to stall at the bottom when it's dumping powder into the case, because we can't make the powder fall any faster. So on a small pistol, there's not much needed. On something large, like an example of a 308 or even 223, 26 to 47 grains, you do want to pause it at the bottom for just a moment to give it that little tenth of a second to drop all the granules of powder in. My go-to is typically a 301, a 301, and I can adjust from there as to what's necessary for the caliber that I'm loading. Now, the move to bottom feature is something that we're going to use quite often when we're setting dies, and that's also a place that I can verify my proper calibration. The last feature is our bottom slowdown, which typically is used for trimming or forming 3 to 300 blackout. To give you an example, what it does is just like it says, it slows down just the bottom portion of the stroke, which can come in very handy when we're trimming or forming brass. For normal operation, I want to leave that off. Now, one thing I would like to point out is how do we check calibration? And so to do so, we visually look, we see if it travels all the way to the bottom, but we can always check our work and verify. So a way to do that is to press our setup, press move to bottom, and again put the press in neutral. So by putting the stop button and neutral, and again using the 11/16 box wrench, I can make sure that I should only have the tiniest bit of travel before hitting the bottom of the stroke. This ensures me that I don't have any obstructions, and I can also check once my dies are set to make sure. So to repeat that, I will hit end cycle, move to bottom, stop, neutral, and make sure that I don't have excessive travel. Perfect. The one feature that you did talk about is clear shell plate. That is what we call a legacy feature, and it's designed for the 1050, and that's due to not being able to index the shell plate without the tool head dropping slowly. So if you see this, it does drop the tool head, but it's not necessary on the Revolution platform, and I'll show you why, is because we can index the shell plate at any time or any position of the tool head.